Now I know you've probably all seen how to build an NES collection for $100. You've probably seen this process repeated for the SNES, the Master System, the Mega Drive, the PlayStation, PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360, the list goes on. But now that you've seen the rest, it's time for me to show you the best, because I'm going to show you how to build a ZX Spectrum collection for £100 or less, coming right up after these. Now the ZX Spectrum of course is a little bit obscure, unless of course you grew up in the 80s, maybe early 90s in the UK. So if you're watching this from outside the UK, collecting for the ZX Spectrum isn't exactly going to be a piece of cake. And it's for that very reason that I've decided to scour eBay, find a selection of ZX Spectrum games that cover just about every genre, and of course sprinkle in a few very important titles indeed. So sit back, relax and enjoy my selection of ZX Spectrum games that you should start your collection with, and all for under £100, and that's definitely under $100 as well. Now there's absolutely no way on this planet that you can have a ZX Spectrum collection without having Horace in there somewhere. Horace was the very first of the ZX Spectrum mascots and arguably one of the first video game mascots of all time. Now he might not have the looks and charms of Mario or Sonic, but what he lacked in regards to those he made up for in love and frustration, because the Horace games could be quite frustrating at times. Now Horace did have 3 games, but I have decided to go with Horace Goes Skiing on this occasion, and quite simply because out of the 3 games this is the most engaging of them all. We are of course talking about a game from 1983, so don't expect wonderful things, but it is a nice mashup of both Frogger and any generic skiing game that you got back then. Like most games of that time, it is a rinse and repeat game where you're just trying to get the highest score you can get and then beat it. But as I said at the beginning, Horace was an absolute icon and still is to this day, and this is where you're going to have your little piece of Horace in your ZX Spectrum collection, and all for the paltry price of £3.99. Now you can't have a video game collection without having at least one example of a fighting game, and in this case the wonderful brawler Target Renegade. Now I'll be the first one to put my hands up and say I don't quite have the reflexes to play brawlers anymore. But this 1988 classic from Imagine Software should be one of the first ones on your list if you're collecting for the ZX Spectrum. Clever use of monochromatic sections made the colour clash that haunted the ZX Spectrum a great deal more manageable in this particular title, and the sprites are not only massive but wonderfully animated as well. The controls are tight, the hitboxes are well managed, and any death that you incur in this game, well, it's all your fault. So no excuses are left for you if you do die playing this game. And when you do fall in love with Target Renegade, and you will, you can then go back and play Renegade, the first game in the series, and look forward to the 3rd game in the series as well. And you can pick up this absolute gem for the minuscule price of £6.99. Released initially for the Commodore 64, yuck, in 1984, the smash hit Raid Over Moscow did get a far superior ZX Spectrum port in 1985, and if there ever was a game that encapsulated the time period it was released in, well, Raid Over Moscow is certainly that. The story goes that the USSR have launched a nuclear strike on the USA, who unfortunately are unable to respond in a traditional manner. Fortunately, however, you get to take control of an elite team of fighter pilots who are currently stationed in a satellite in Earth's orbit. Now, like most 8-bit microcomputer games of the time, this is a multi-stage game where the player is required to master not just one gameplay mechanic but several to get to the end of the game, with side-scrolling vertical shooters and third-person over-the-shoulder shooters being just some of the examples on display here, making Raid Over Moscow at a mere £8 absolutely fantastic value for money when it comes to adding to your collection. Now, it wasn't all arcade hijinks when it came to games on the ZX Spectrum, and what we have here from Firebird Software in 1986 is Rebelstar, one of the very first tactical turn-based games that you could get your hands on. Now, tactical turn-based games aren't everyone's cup of tea, but if you have got the patience to play a game that's basically computer chess but a little bit more graphically appealing, then Rebelstar will be right up your street. It has a very heavy Star Wars aesthetic, and just to add that extra bit of spice, it's not just a one-player game, but it's a two-player game also. So if you did have the privilege of a friend coming over to play video games with you, then Rebelstar would be one of those games that could cater to that particular need. Being one of the most important games on the list, however, does mean it does have a slightly higher price tag, but even that is the measly price of £15.99 and well worth every penny for this piece of video game history. Next up, we have another main staple of the ZX Spectrum library, and that is the platforming adventure game. In Finders Keepers, which is the first of the Magic Knight trilogy, you find yourself tasked to find the perfect present for Princess Germantrude, which will allow you to become a fully fledged member of the Octagon table. Now, before we go any further, I'm obliged to tell you that games like this were an exercise in frustration. Obviously, at their core, they were simple platform games. Well, by simple I mean they were absolutely pixel perfect platforming games, where even half a pixel out will make you fail your jump. With the Magic Knight having no way to attack his enemies makes this fundamentally much more of a puzzle maze game than an actual platforming game. There are plenty of sections in the game where you just cannot avoid your enemy, but this is kind of reflected fairly when it comes to the life section. It's fortunately not a one hit one death. You do have a life bar, and along with that life bar you have several lives. But as I've already indicated, don't let that fool you, this is not an easy game by any stretch of the imagination. It is of course the first part of a very important series when it comes to the ZX Spectrum, and falls into one of the most popular genres of the time, making the game a must have and an absolute steal at £3.99. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that I'm not a big sports game fan, but that doesn't mean there aren't a couple of sports genres out there that I have as guilty pleasures, and quite possibly the first of these guilty pleasures for me was the track and field games. Now, of course, the original track and field, released in 1983 for the arcades, was an absolute beast of a machine, so it didn't take long for the popularity of that particular genre to take off and make its way into other systems. And although there is a host of titles out there for the ZX Spectrum that are track and field clones, first one that I would recommend to anyone out there for the ZX Spectrum is Konami's Hypersports, and mainly just because of the wide variety of sports it has on offer. It has examples of traditional track and field sports like the triple jump, but also lets you engage in other more interesting activities such as weightlifting and archery, and it is Konami, so you do get that seal of quality that does come with it. And despite the fact that it does come with the hazard that your keyboard or joystick or whatever you're using is going to take some amount of pummeling, for £4.80 it's worth every penny and anyone's money. Now, if Red Dead Redemption 2 had a great-great-grandpappy, then the Wild Bunch would certainly be it. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't games involving the Wild West and cowboys back in the 80s or even 70s for that matter, but they tended to be more arcade action than anything else. So rather than the high-paced action of Sunset Riders, Gunsmoke and, dare I say, Custer's Revenge, the Wild Bunch was much more akin to a cowboy RPG. Granted, it's nothing like the wonders that we have today with the likes of Red Dead Redemption 2, as this was an input-based decision-making RPG, but it is an RPG nonetheless. The story in the Wild Bunch is quite simple. You're walking home one night, you find a body lying in the street, and with its last words he describes his killer to you. Unfortunately for you, the law turn up right at the last minute and they think you were the killer. So in the Wild Bunch, it's your job to hunt down the Wild Bunch, or more specifically the individual that was described to you, and bring them to justice. And to do that, you're going to have to move from town to town, check out the local sheriff offices and look for wanted posters. To be able to do that, however, you're going to need to play some poker to make some money so you can afford to buy a horse, extra bullets for your gun because you don't know who you're going to face out there, and eventually have a high noon showdown with the bad guys themselves. Oh, and of course you're going to have to avoid the law yourself, so keep an eye on those telegraph offices. But for $9.99, this is a must-have game if you're going to start a ZX Spectrum collection. So Wonder Boy wasn't one of the games that I was considering when I was putting this list together. The reason that Wonder Boy is on this list is because, well, you probably read it in the title there, Sega had insisted on it. Now I'm not just including Wonder Boy because Sega had insisted on it, although there is a little bit of that, but not for the reasons that you might think. It's not that I fear any retribution from the wonderful Sega head, it's just that I think if we come together collectively as a community and give Sega head enough peace of mind, he'll finally finish that wonderful Soul Reaver audiobook that he's putting together and we'll all have the pleasure of listening to it. All that being said, of course, Wonder Boy is a wonderful addition to your ZX Spectrum library because it does give an example of what can be done on that little 8-bit machine. Now I'm sure most of you who have experienced Wonder Boy before have all played it on the Master System, where yes, it does look much better, but the Master System was designed for playing games where the ZX Spectrum was absolutely not. So in many ways it's an incredible feat of determination by the developers to get a game like this on the ZX Spectrum, and at the absolute minuscule price of £5.99, well, it's a no-brainer. Go get some Wonder Boy on the ZX Spectrum. For the longest of times now, people have been banging on about bringing Bully back, giving Bully, or Canis Canum Edit if you're over here in the UK, an HD remaster. But I say to you, never mind any HD remasters of Bully and let's look at Skool Daze. Skool Daze, for all intents and purposes, is Bully before Bully was even a thing. You play the role of a young man making his way through the school week and hopefully not getting expelled. Yes, of course, there's certain tasks that you have to complete, there's certain classes you have to go to, and probably more importantly, you've got to make sure you don't accumulate too many lines, because if you do, it's game over. So again, I say to you, forget Bully HD Remaster and look at Skool Daze, because Skool Daze even got a sequel in Back to School. So once you do finish this absolute gem of a game, you have something else to look forward to without praying to the HD Remaster gods. And for a paltry £9, it's a must buy for your ZX Spectrum collection. Now there was going to be absolutely no way that this video would conclude without Orbiter being mentioned, because as I've said time and time again, Orbiter is one of my favourite games on the ZX Spectrum. And yes, looking at it you can see it's a simple Defender clone, but this was a Defender clone from 1982 and running on an 8-bit microcomputer that wasn't designed to play games. Now did you get the same experience playing Orbiter at home that you did playing Defender in the arcade? Well, obviously not, but it was very close and very close indeed. And again, I'm going to highlight the fact that this is a game from 1982, a time when most people were still playing on their Atari 2600s, and the Atari 2600 couldn't produce a game like this. And how much will this vintage gem cost you? Well, £6.99, an absolute bargain. So if you are starting a ZX Spectrum collection, you could start with Orbiter. So there you go, my friends, that's how I would recommend that you start your ZX Spectrum collection for £100 or less. Now of course, if the ZX Spectrum is nothing new to you, did I make any glaring errors? Were there any games that you would perhaps put in there instead? And if of course you don't know the ZX Spectrum, did this pique your interest? Are you now keen to delve into the ZX Spectrum library and maybe start collecting yourself? Because if so, on any of those 2 points, drop down into the comments and let me know, because interaction between you and me, well, that's what makes YouTube special. It does for me anyway. Thank you very much for watching as always, and until next time, cheerio!